Hello and welcome to Putting Your Release Nightmares to Bed. Today's webinar is sponsored by Split by Harness and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech and I'm excited to be your moderator for this spooky Halloween event. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that are going to help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in your webinar control panel. So not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most audio, video, and slide advancement issues. But if that doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Now, second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. I'd especially like to call your attention to a PDF from Split that is a do no harm rollout best practice guide. Whether you choose to use the solution you hear about today, you'll find really valuable steps and other sort of agnostic information in there. So I highly recommend downloading that. It's a great resource. There are also some links labeled ATM, which stands for Actual Tech Media. One of those is the ATM Decisions Group. It's a panel of IT decision makers you can apply to join to participate in some more in-depth events and other opportunities. Also, there's a link to the ATM Events Center, which has a calendar of more upcoming events like this one. So I highly encourage you to access those resources now and feel free to share them with your friends and colleagues. Now, third, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the link with the details there. Now, finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So to help encourage those questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card. This one for $50 for the best question. After the event is over, we'll look at all the questions that came in, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. Okay, with that housekeeping out of the way, let's get right into today's haunted content. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to our panelists today. We have Dave Caro, who's Principal Progressive Delivery Advocate. We have Pierre Moss, who is VP of Engineering. We have Joy Eberts, who's Principal Software Engineer. And we have got so many people, I can't find everybody in the console here. We have David Martin, who's Staff Solutions Engineer. So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. Dave Caro, I'll turn things over to you and take it away.
All right. Thanks so much. You hear me okay, Scott?
Yep, you sound great.
Awesome. Although a bit of a frog in the throat. So here's what we're going to do. It's ghoulishly simple. Hope you like my Halloween color scheme. So going to play a little video. Some of you may have seen a video we did on social media, but we're going to play a little video to kind of get started to set sort of the stage of what it's like to be a developer with big problems to solve. And then we'll move into some, I really want to thank a lot of people for the patterns of your pain, the submissions you guys gave for problems you faced. We'll talk about some patterns we saw in those submissions. And then PA and Joy and I will have some conversations about their survival stories. They each recorded a video. We'll play the videos. We'll talk to them. We'll learn some stuff. Then we'll have a short little section I'm calling What If You Release Differently, which is really kind of the main reason that I do these things is I'm looking to share some knowledge about some practices that the teams are doing that actually reduce these issues and make life a lot easier. And then David Martin will give us a demo of feature management with release monitoring built in. So what if you had a way of rolling things out and had your features watching out for you instead of you having to watch them. And then finally, the Q&A, the goodies, that's a reference to that PDF that I think you should grab when you get a chance. And then ways you can continue the conversation before winter sets in. So imagine let's see, I'm going to go one more slide, I guess. So let's talk about going on vacation. I'm going to roll this video. Okay, so hopefully you found that entertaining. One of my colleagues, Justin, made that. That's one of the favorite things I've ever seen somebody put together. It's pretty awesome. So now, as promised, I just want to spend a couple of minutes talking about some of the patterns we saw in the submissions you did, and I really want to acknowledge there were a handful of you that wrote practically some, compelling essays. You're good storytellers. So I don't really have the time to read these verbatim because we want to make sure you get a chance to kind of hear the rest of our team do their stuff. But the thing I wanted to kind of point out is the patterns, because there were a lot of patterns that repeated, right? There were a lot of all or nothing releases where there's months of work that's going into something and then it gets rolled out kind of all at once at 11:59 in the middle of the night, right? And that's, when we were making golden CDs, we had no choice. We had to work for months and make the stuff and put it on CDs, and we had box and docks, and you're shipping it out. And then we moved to online, but we still had a lot of us still live in a world where we work for months on a big release, and then we cross our fingers and flip the switch. So that's a pattern that repeats a lot. There were many missed opportunities to gradually expose the release and get feedback. One of my favorites was a hey, in fact, I'm gonna find this one because it's hilarious. The idea of having, so you've got 6,000 machines across 300 offices and only 3 techs that can physically manage those machines. And through a goof in the packaging and deployment of the AV antivirus update, they bricked basically all 6,000 machines and had to be manually, imagine 3 people on that many planes, right? And if instead you had tested it in the local office first, then after you bricked them, you could have fixed them without ever getting on a plane, right? And right, so the whole CrowdStrike thing is kind of the same idea, really, which is, there was this thing that wasn't caught until it rolled out, but they rolled it out to everybody all at once, and so there was no way to stop it, because by the time they figured out what was happening, people were already deep in pain, right? So missed opportunities to gradually expose, release, and get feedback, however you get feedback. And then the last one is that there were a lot of horror stories about how rollbacks didn't exactly go as planned. That rollbacks take longer than you would think. They're harder than you think. And there was even one about, we thought we fixed it, but we were in a maintenance window, and so we couldn't even test whether our fix was working, right? So just some patterns about, this is really, and we'll see when we get to kind of some of the suggestions for how to do things better, we'll see how you can overcome those patterns with just some changes in how you expose your changes. But I want to get into the good stuff, because PA and Joy have a lot of really interesting stuff to share with us. And before PA shares his story, we're going to have his video here that he recorded for us. PA, for a VP of engineering, I don't know if you like at a side gig in community theater or what, but it's pretty good. Here we go.
Once upon a time, I worked at a company where we built naively our own feature flags. So scary. We stored them in our database. Fast access and already a cache, so clever. So scary. We built a shiny feature that was also using the database. We thought we were safe. We had our clever feature flags. I smell blood. We turn it on, and as fast as the Reaper, the new feature hit the database so hard that it just killed it. Turn it off! Too late. The database is dead. We can't turn it off either. There's blood everywhere. What a nightmare. The ghost of software came with a vengeance and slayed everything. Boo! Stop the horror. Go with a feature flag management tool that won't haunt you.
Whoop, I would say that was epic, PA. I imagine that's not the only survival story you have out there.
I burnt a few things, yes. But that one was pretty fun. On the feature flags, um, it's like when you tie your feature flag systems to the same system that you're using to control, like for your application, then everything's tied together. When one thing dies, everything dies. So that was one pattern, and it's hard to basically really think about how things are tied up together. It doesn't feel like the code is tied up. It's just system crossing over and overlapping, and so that causes some pain. Um, that's one pattern that we've seen, like that easily happen when we build things, quickly. We use whatever is already handy. It goes faster. It's easy to put together, and so take the path of least resistance, and then we forget that separation is useful. We had other nightmare stories. One was not exactly a release, but also like how things are tied up together. That was, I heard of a story where like a data center went down, lost power, and essentially what happened is that we had active passive data centers, so it was we were used to flipping between the two. It was just a simple command on the configuration system to flip the database primary to the other data center, and everything would just run. The thing when we practice those things, the data center was never down, and we never realized that the configuration system was depending on the same things, and so the primary location of the configuration system happened to be in the same data center that went down, and the primary of the database was also there, and so all of those things disappeared from the surface of the Earth all at once, and we had no mechanism to control the configuration anymore. And so that was a painful experience.
Actually, I think what's interesting about these two stories, right, is that sometimes we'll talk about feature flags are good for decoupling deploy from release, but the other decoupling is really common to both these stories, which is decoupling this control from the rest of your infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly.
If you had a feature flag to control this active passive thing, it would have lived outside of your data center in the cloud, and your CDN or whatever it was that the pieces that were outside the data center would have gotten the message, right?
As long as it's really separated and doesn't have system overlaps in some fashion, then yes, you keep your control. And those are like pretty innocuous, and they're hard to basically really think through until it kind of burns you. So that's the learning experience. There's always some things underneath, some relations that are like hiding, and it takes a lot of digging to find those.
Yeah, I mean, today we're talking mostly about how we can help with feature flags and with release monitoring built in and such, but Harness has another module, a chaos module, right? And it's literally, you can do clever stuff like starve the CPU of a machine, or make a network interface die even though it's not really dead. And it's just a way to get a little closer to being able to test those scenarios, as opposed to doing your dry run where you said, okay, let's pretend the data center's down. Now let's move to the secondary, right? And
but you can never cut ties like as strongly as like you just lost power. And that's the exercise is never fully complete until it actually happens.
Right.
Yeah, that was a good learning experience. More tied up to release. We had a situation like here, I think at Split like a few years ago, where we were moving to Kubernetes, and I think our database, I forgot if it was a database or another service that was pretty loaded, and like CPU was pretty high, and then we released, and then essentially it resetted all the connections all at once, and essentially it swarmed the depending service and the database, and it ran out of IO, it ran out of CPU. And so you would think that after it stabilized, everything goes back down, but because we had logic on the health of the service that we were restarting, that was depending on the health of the database, something not to do. Then essentially, because the database was not really working properly under duress, then the service marked itself as not functioning properly and just kept on restarting automatically in Kubernetes. And so we just kept basically creating pain on the database that just had no room to feel like breathe and recover. And essentially we had to shut down the service and bring it back like little by little so that we could recover. So that's also the effect of how you roll things out and basically how brutal your operation might be can create huge spikes that can be hard to recover from.
Yeah, I suspect Joy's got a story to tell us about data migrations or moving data layers. It's fascinating. You know, I'm more of a spectator. I've been a long time since I wrote any code, but it's fascinating to see the patterns that are now possible, where you can literally stand up your new data infrastructure and make sure it does everything you want it to do before you even really depend on it. And then after you prove you can depend on it, you just move over and the users don't even know, as opposed to the good old days where we would go down on a Friday afternoon and promise to be back up by, Monday morning, with a lot of crossed fingers. And yeah, anyway, thank you, PA. I'm gonna jump. I want to show Joy's video, and then we'll have some time to kind of circle back around too if you have some more thoughts. So let's look at what Joy had to do here.
We thought that we were doing the right thing at my last company. We were using feature flags after all. We had built them ourselves, but we accidentally created zombies. Zombies! We were using a percentage rollout, which seemed like the right thing, but every time we were creating mutations for the small 1%. We were doing percentage rollouts based on the user ID, and people with 001 were getting all of the mutations, creating zombie accounts that were totally unusable. Don't be like us. Don't create zombies. Use a feature flag management platform instead.
Right. That, by the way, is also a story that repeats, because I remember when I was learning about how LinkedIn was doing what they did before they built a real system for this. They were using the last digits of a user ID, and it meant that the same folks either meant people got a lot of the same stuff, or they spent all their time arguing about which user ID suffixes that each team could use for an experiment. So it's funny how the patterns do repeat quite a lot. So what do you want to tell us more about that story, or tell us about another one?
Sure. I mean, just a little bit more about that story is we were trying to do the right thing. We did percentage rollouts on almost all of our features, but as mentioned there, when you start with 1% or even 5% or whatever, it always hits those users that come with the 001 or the 002 percentages, which means that if there are any bugs in our features, they always got those bugs. And so I knew a coworker who had one of those accounts, and I didn't really even think about it personally until he was like, oh yeah, my free account is unusable half the time because anytime there's a problem, it hits that account. And I like to think it wasn't quite that bad. Hopefully we didn't have that many bugs, but when you do, you want to spread it across your users so that maybe a user only sees it once every long time instead of every single time there's a problem.
One thought on that.
Story.
I would say one point to be clear, you guys weren't really doing a random thing. Your percentage rollout was actually just a slice of a static set of people, right? And so This is what's different about the approach we'll talk about later, which is that not only do you want to use really real randomization, so you get a good slice of your population across different groups, but also you want to randomize it separately for each feature. So, if you would basically, even in your situation, if you said, well, this time we're going to use, it's a 1%, but we're going to do the people who end in 7 or what, I don't know, right? But yeah, so that randomization is really powerful, and having a separate seed for each change that you roll out is very powerful. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This is more of the solutions, but let's go back to what else did you want to share?
Yeah, you alluded to the other story I wanted to touch on, which is related to being able to use, I guess, parity testing with feature flags. So again, at a previous company, we were doing a massive change with our authorization system. We had an old homegrown authorization framework. It was, I don't know, maybe 25 files with like hundreds and hundreds of lines per file. And it was one of those things where anytime there was a change in our permissions, like nobody wanted to touch these files. Everybody was too terrified to like do anything. At some point we created a diagram, a decision tree diagram of our files and like what would happen. And it was just this like huge thing. So anyway, this is just to give you a little bit of context about how this was a very scary feature. We built an entirely new system, but before we switched over traffic to the new system, what we did was we basically did a mirror deploy. So using a feature flag, instead of just having on-off states, we had on-mirror-off states. And so the mirror was sending traffic to the old system, and that was what was getting returned to the user. But at the same time, we also sent traffic to the new system and then checked if the results were the same and logged them if they weren't. And as a result of doing this, we actually realized that we had completely forgotten an entire feature that we needed to implement. So it would have been extremely bad if we had released that. Like we would have had so many angry customers, and like security is important, right? Especially at a company selling to other companies. So, but because we had this parity testing, we were able to catch all of that without affecting a single user. And so instead of it being this big outage, big deal, like lawyers involved, it was a pretty minor thing where we're like, oh, we're going to have to push out that release by, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, which I'm sure management was a little annoyed by, but in the grand scheme of things, they were very happy.
Right. And why don't you replay that again in terms of, let's say you redid it, you fixed that problem, and then you do a parity. You're doing this parity testing again. The flags are basically determining which systems get exposed to the data and which system is authoritative to the user, right? So in your test, the legacy which you trusted remained authoritative while you ran your parity test. The new one was getting those bytes and sending back the results, and then you were able to compare the legacy to the new, make sure that they were telling the same story. If things went well, how do you go forward from there?
Yeah, so then assuming we weren't getting logs, then we could start to switch over to on. So we had this 3-state thing. We had off, which was just entirely old system. We had parity, which you can actually do 4 states if you want. So I'm going to complicate things slightly. So you can do parity, which is what I was talking about, where it's old system source as truth, sends traffic to new system, and then compares the results and log if they're different. Once you realize there's a problem, though, you can turn it to mirror, which is going to stop the logging because we already know there's a problem and we don't want to blow up our logs further. But this allows you to stress test that new system still. So you can still continue to test if the infrastructure is working, even though you know there's a logical error somewhere. And then the 4th state, which is on, which is basically, so once you're pretty sure with your mirror and your parity, then you can start to roll to on, which basically means that the new system is the complete source of truth. So all users are going to start getting, or percentage of users, and then eventually all users will start getting only the new system.
Yeah, and I think important for people who are following along is that those aren't deployments. Those aren't, we push another set of code that does the next phase. It's that code was all in place, and you were just changing flags as you went through the process without having to do an additional deploy.
Exactly.
Right. So it's pretty powerful to actually be able to move between those modes from a console somewhere or an API command and not have any network routing to do, not have any pods to bring up or take down, not have any deployments to do. And that's, yeah. Awesome.
And for example, once your logs are blowing up, being able to turn those off in, maximum 5 minutes, as opposed to the, I don't know, 40 plus minutes it's going to take for a deployment pipeline potentially. That's a big deal.
Or if you're not disciplined and you're allowed to mess with production, going in and basically taking down one server, changing the fig, restarting it, and going through all your servers one at a time, that's not currently best practice in an immutable world. But not all of us live in the right. Awesome. So in the interest of making sure we get through the rest, we'll move on to the next little bit here, and then we'll come back and see if we have a little more time to chat in a bit. But thank you very much, Joy and PA. So this is the section where we're just going to share some ideas. Some of these you'll be familiar with already, and some of them you'll be like, wait, I don't know if that's possible. The question is, what if you release differently, right? And I kind of alluded to some of this earlier when I was talking about, wow, there's a lot of people that are sort of bundling up all their work and shipping it all at once. And there's people that are exposing it to everybody all at once. And there's people that are having a hard time rolling back because there's a lot of mechanics in the rolling back, right? So to kind of set the stage, I want to, many of you have probably heard of progressive delivery. The practices of progressive delivery started quite a while ago, but the name was, I guess, maybe 5 years ago, a Red Monk analyst coined this term. And the idea was this was a name for more modern ways to roll software out that addressed some fundamental problems. And if you look down the left side of this slide, avoiding downtime, so not having a maintenance interval where you're down for the weekend, limiting the blast radius, which is if I do have an unexpected issue, how many people do I affect and how long are they affected, right? And then the next one, limiting work in progress in order to achieve flow. And that's really, how do I ship smaller pieces more often? Now, if every release is a nightmare, the idea of shipping more often, most people will be like, no, thank you. But ironically, if you can ship more often in smaller pieces, you have fewer problems that are big. And then the last one, they're learning during the process. So the term progressive delivery was actually kind of jointly coined between Sam Guckenheimer, who was at the time with Microsoft, and the analyst who went by the handle Monk chips, right? And the deal was that Sam was saying, when we roll things out, we do a progressive experiment where we want to see what happens, and we want to learn as much as we can as soon as we can so that we don't affect everybody, right? So that's kind of a tell about, like, it's not just can I gradually expose, but I need to gradually expose and observe in the same context, right? And if you look at the chart, it gets more yellow to the right. And what's happening on the right side is not only, blue-green is pretty good at avoiding downtime and limiting the blast radius. As you go to the right, basically feature flags started filling in more of these boxes and making it more able for people to achieve the flow and ship much smaller pieces and decouple deploy from release. And then feature flags with data integrated is that sort of holy grail on the right, which really, in another way of looking at it, is that's experimentation, which is I want to be able to expose changes and observe at the individual layer of the changes. Which leads me to this next little bit, which is what's different if you use this technology where we have feature flags with built-in measurement. And most of you know that feature flags let you decouple deploy from release, but what can happen in the middle? I think one of the other examples that I think we've heard from some people is that they've got feature flags they built, but quite often they're just on and off. They're toggles, right? And so they're toggling on and off for everybody, maybe with the ability to override for the internal team to do some testing and production, but generally kind of on-off switch. And then people graduate to being able to do percentage rollouts. You were doing percentage rollouts, but you were doing it with user IDs, Joey, right? Like, so it was gradual exposure, extra bonus points, right? But if we use randomization and we go through these, what are the steps we can do? And the first one is by rolling out to a small percentage, we can mitigate error risk. So those things that we only find out when we're in prod. One of my favorite stories was about, the end users needed the app to auto refresh because the way they were using it, data would get kind of garbled if it didn't have some kind of auto refresh built in. The developers never auto refresh because they didn't think they needed to. If they had just rolled out to a few users, they would have seen that problem early on and wouldn't have to bring down the entire department, right? So mitigating error risk by going out to a small percentage of users, right? And I'm going to first go through this just kind of in a big way, which is like, let's say things are going well. Well, it might be good to stop at sort of 70 or 80% of your population and ride through a peak traffic period. Because if you've got an issue you've introduced that affects scale, you'll see it here, but it probably won't bring you down, right? And then the one in the middle there that I'm going to draw last is you might want to stop in the middle there with sort of 50-50 on, off, because that's the easiest way to prove that the thing you are trying to affect is actually being affected. So if you are releasing this, if the main goal of this release is to get more people to sign up or get more to reduce the cost of serve, it's easier to measure that when you have what we call maximum power, 50-50 going through. And implicit in what I'm doing here is that I'm talking about shipping smaller bits of work more often. So this isn't really about a giant big bang release. This is how do I ship lots of things often and learn as I go, right? So this report came out a couple months ago, which was the State of Feature Management Experimentation 2024. Lead Dev did this research. We sponsored it, but they used an independent third party to conduct it, and they asked 500 engineering leaders how they're releasing features in 2024. And what's really encouraging, actually, is that 79% of them saw the value of risk mitigation and instant triage by having feature level monitoring and experimentation, basically being able to see at the feature level what's going on. So, almost 80% of them thought that, that, and when it says instant triage, what they're getting at there is if you know at a feature level whether something's causing a problem, you don't have to figure out which feature is causing the problem. 78% saw feature iteration and optimization of benefit of this, that's traditional experimentation. I want to iterate on an idea and optimize to make sure it works the best it can. And again, whether that's cost to serve or performance, or whether that's business outcomes, right? And 82% of the people who thought they were successful in these things had the ability to measure system performance and user behavior at the feature level. Of those who did not have the ability to effectively watch at the feature level when they rolled stuff out, only 16% thought they were successful. So that is why these different ways of working can be pretty powerful. It's really kind of a binary thing. If you have the ability to measure at the feature level, life's different. And I want to drill in on that a little bit, and then we'll kind of get to the demo so you can see how this really works. But measurement at the feature level, why is it called feature management and experimentation, right? Or is it all about A/B testing? Well, actually, no, it's not. It's really actually about how you can watch things. So imagine you've got a change, and your change has a JIRA ticket, BFF 129, and you're going to roll that out to 5% of the users are going to see it, and 95% are not. And so you're exposing it to a subset of users. And as I said earlier, randomization is important. And in this case, you're randomizing uniquely for BFF 129. So this 5% 95 split of users is not the same that a different feature would get. And the result is that we'll be able to filter out the other changes we're rolling out and any external events that are affecting performance. In this case, in this example, I'm going to zoom in on page load time. But it could be any metric, and it should be a number of them at the same time, actually. So if we graph the distribution of page load times that the off people are seeing, and then we graph the page load times that the on people are seeing, you can just glance at this and know there's a difference, right? It's clearly taking the page load time is longer for the people in the on cohort, right? Now, you could do what you see here sort of by hand. And by that, I mean, you could set up your own experiment. You could have a data scientist doing some reporting. You could do some instrumentation. You could sort of go through. But for every little change you're doing, you're not going to have the cycles to do that, right? So what's different about having feature management experimentation built into the way you release is that you can do this for everything you do. So on the next slide here, imagine you're achieving this more progressive delivery vision where you're rolling out smaller changes more often, but you don't want to have a war room every time you roll out one little feature, right? So how could you monitor a constant stream of changes being released? I'm going to play out an animation here, and I want you to guess which feature is causing a problem. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? But something that's subtle and it's important to notice is that the last one, Web 837, was the last thing we released. And so if you're just kind of watching generic graphs and charts for if things are going sideways, you might think that Web 837 is what's causing the rise in latency in your app, right? But it'd be more powerful to know that it's actually this one here so you can go about fixing it, right? So that's what I wanted to show you in just some concepts. And I want to hand it over to David Martin and let him actually give you a demo of what this looks like in the real world.
Thanks, Dave. Are you ready for me?
I am ready.
All right. So I'm going to show you how you actually can put into practice some of what Dave is talking about. So the way that we normally show our, and I can't tell if my screen now shared.
We got it.
Great. So for the Halloween webinar here, we decided to have a frightful group of users depicted by these boxes that you see at the left.
Actually, David, one thing is that we've got the split by harness window, but not the boxes app. So I think you've shared maybe the window and not the desktop.
That's possible, actually. So let me see if I can fix that. So I go back here, and I go here. Try this again. This one. Thank you, Dave, for stopping me.
No worries.
Yeah, we've got to have our blood red frightful boxes for the Halloween.
Now I'm feeling it.
Now we're feeling it. Good. So the point here is to communicate how you can use Harness to release a feature, maybe even infect a population with your feature. And the population in this case is all that blood red color because the flag is switched all off. And if I wanted to, I could infect them all at once by switching to on. But it misses the opportunity to flush out bugs, flush out performance problems, all the things that we've been talking about today. So how can you engage in that? Well, to start with, you could turn on the feature, the infection, for specific users. So I'm not picking on any of them in particular. Whoops, I'll do C5 again. And then maybe T6 down at the bottom. There's only a population of about 250 users here, but you can see now that the ones that I picked are showing up in a deeper blue, maybe a blood from the veins blue. So we could pass the feature out to additional safe groups, like maybe a set of beta users, or as is often popular, to turn on the feature for employees. This is a phase with Harness where you're trying to identify that the backend algorithm doesn't throw an error. Maybe that the latency looks good in that initial couple of runs. On the front end, you'll look for things like whether it's the right font, or that it's the right font size, that it's centered, that the box, that all those types of things that you can catch really before anybody has been exposed to your feature. But it's important that it's done in production, because a lot of times the production software, the network, the hardware is different from stage. You can't have a staging area that's exactly like production. So we'll do this. And then in the next phase, you can start to roll the feature out to, and Dave, I heard talking about this earlier, it's finding that good segment of the population. So the Harness SDK knows how to roll out randomly, and it does it by taking the user's identifier, hashing it with a unique flag for the, number for the flag, and then bucketing that. So what happens here is that everybody that bucketed 0 through 9 is switched on at this point, gets the blue bucketing. And the rest of the users are still switched off. If we go to 20%, for example, we don't shuffle and give a new group of users the feature. That would completely corrupt ramping and experiments. Instead, we ramp it. So now 0 through 19 is switched on. And of course, this will eventually be a situation where you want to roll to half of your population. You don't have to do it with the entire population. There is a way here to limit the exposure and say, I want to do 50% of 10%, right? This is also possible. Or maybe you want to be even more specific and you want to say, and this is with our targeting feature, you can say, I want users that are in a particular region. So I'll pick on, say, Europe or North America, maybe even an age range. A quick note about this, Split's architecture is set up so that it's actually safe to work with this private information, because we don't transport it to our cloud. We don't need it in our cloud. Our SDK actually knows how to look at a rule like this. Even something this sophisticated, it'll do locally inside your mobile application or inside the browser. And of course, it's also secure on the server side. So release monitoring. If you use the Split suite, when you put the feature flags into your application code, you will automatically get performance measurement. And you can see some of the metrics here that come out. The ones that look good are in yellow. The interaction to next paint. These, by the way, come from Web Vitals, which is a Google project, open source that we use, or the largest contentful paint. You can think about these types of metrics as being like the page load time divided up into smaller pieces so that you can understand the page load performance for the user at a more granular level. And so the 4 yellow metrics that we see here, those would be a do no harm result from release monitoring. Nothing happens in response to getting yellow. It means that there was no statistically significant lift or drop. Now the green one is happy. The green one is telling us that the first input delay was reduced. So we saw, in fact, a 14% reduction, and that's fantastic. But there is a red one here, and it's pretty angry looking. The number of errors has sprung up by almost 500%. So this is a feature, erratum it's called, that has a problem. And what's going to happen as a result of harness being in place is that an alert goes off. Here's an example of the alert. And when it arrives, it tells you this feature of your application is having an unexpected increase in the errors. And so you can now, at this point, come back and roll back the feature that's affected by clicking this kill button here. But I do want to highlight before I go that you can have many features that are all being monitored for release at the same time by that same the same set of metrics that we're looking at here. But these metrics, in this case, calculate out well. There's nothing to be concerned about. So if you are running many concurrent experiments because you've got many feature releases happening at once, this approach is going to be good enough to get you there. And that's really what Dave was more eloquently speaking to before I started. So, Dave, do you have any comments for me before I quit the share?
No, I think that's good. I think what Dave was pointing out here is that if you have, let's say you're monitoring errors and you're monitoring these web vitals, and you'll notice they were called guardrail metrics. It's kind of an important distinction. A guardrail metric is monitored for every rollout, whether the individual developer rolling out that feature chose to monitor them. They're sort of kind of mandatory and automatic. So one of the patterns at Harness is less toil for the developer to do the right thing automatically, right? Those guardrails are going to be watched across all of them. And one feature might be increasing latency, another one might be increasing errors, rather than just having the getting alert that says something's causing more errors or something's causing more latency. You literally know which one's doing what, and you wouldn't have sort of a fool's errand of chasing after the wrong problem. So the kind of less time in war rooms, more time with the right team fixing it. The rest of the team kind of moves on with building the next thing they got to build. But thank you very much, David. So just to kind of wrap up a little bit of what David was talking about, what we're talking about is having feature flags to control who gets what, and then watching what happens by watching performance and behavioral data, running it through an attribution engine, which is kind of like a big join. So those events coming in don't know what feature flag they're related to until they get to us. They're just events for a user at a point in time. The feature flags, though, know what user saw which feature at what point in time. And the attribution engine, it's its job to basically join those together and say, oh, well, we know that PA was shown this thing, and we also know we got this string of errors from PA, in the time that immediately followed. And by the way, somebody who's going through the exact same flow with that thing turned off didn't get any errors, right? So that's kind of what's happening in there. And as a result of that, the platform not only does feature management, which you'd expect from a feature management solution, but it does release monitoring and experimentation right out of the box, without you having to build your own config and have data scientists kind of putting it all together. And David mentioned the SDK suite, which is just, in that previous slide, we had feature flag data and we had events flowing in. The SDK suite makes it so you don't even have to worry about gathering those events. They will literally just be gathered for you and sent in. And not only are they sent in to Split by Harness, but we'll automatically create metrics. We'll sort of configure it for you. So you literally could be just trying out the system, use a few of these SDKs in a few of your apps, and we're going to basically handle creating those definitions of the metrics, and you'll just see the results. So again, removing toil, making it easier to get to the value faster so that you can focus on shipping products instead of setting stuff up. So on that note, I'll show a slide that if you've seen a talk by me before, you've probably seen this slide. It's kind of an important deal, which is, the quote is, the future is already here, it's just not very evenly distributed. And so many of you may, back when Etsy was giving talks about 100 deployments in a day, and people are like, that's crazy, that's not even possible, right? Like now, many of us know that, Amazon is deploying possibly multiple times per second. These practices exist, and we don't all have access to them necessarily right out of the box. And our goal is to make it easier for any team. We have teams of size 8 that are using the solution, and we have teams of hundreds or thousands of developers using the solution. And the idea is let them have a truck to deliver on rather than having to worry about building a truck from scratch, because we don't all have tens of millions of dollars a year to build our own platform. That's what we wanted to share in the main block, and we're gonna move to Q&A in just a sec. I want to remind you that in the handout section, there's that do no harm best practice guide, and this talks about how to kind of look differently at your releases. I love the cover on this. It's almost like Halloween candy, actually. If anybody wants, I'm not sure I can name the brand it reminds me of, but I think there's plenty of good information in here. Wink, wink. So on the right is a QR code that if you want to actually have a deeper conversation with somebody like David to look at your own environment, look at your own goals, look at your own challenges you face and how you can run better. If you click that, kind of goes to a generic contact me form, but if you scroll down, there's a field in there where it asks, how can we help? And that's the most important field on that form. So if there's something we can help you with, there's a conversation you want to have, please go ahead and hit that QR code and let us know how we can help. And then at this point, I'm going to take just a brief moment and look over the Q&A, and then we will jump in and work our way through that. Let's see here. Interesting. Hey, I'm actually seeing, wait, one moment here. When I went full screen, I actually ended up with not very many of the questions. The questions were there. So give me just a second here. Go back to the other view. David, of course, asked the question, if a ghoul stumbled into our webinar, what would we do?
It hasn't happened yet.
Well, I thought one just did because I saw some really good questions, and now I'm looking at the list.
Well, I see a question about chaos engineering.
Uh-huh.
So I think the question is, would some of the chaos engineering reporting show up together with FME, the feature flag monitoring dashboards that I showed?
Actually, he's probably asking about the lead dev report. The
lead dev report. Okay.
Right. And that report didn't go into chaos testing in particular. It's a great question. I think that I love here's why I love the question, because we just became part of Harness a few months ago. And what some of the more fun questions around the water cooler, Joy's smiling, because what some of the more interesting things are, like, what if we connect this to that? And what if our cloud cost module could tell you whether the feature flag is costing you more? Or what if we could have the chaos testing tied to the feature flags so that, et cetera, right? I mean, the combinations are very interesting. So that report to answer that question, that report didn't actually get into that particular thing. One question that we've got here is, what are the most common release management challenges you've encountered, and how can we proactively address them to avoid nightmares? Which sounds a bit like the mission of the webinar in the first place. But I would say, Joy or PA, do you want to take a shot at just, if you were to kind of bubble up, common challenges and how we can proactively avoid them with some of the stuff we've been talking about? Who wants to take that one?
Want to start? I can go after.
Okay.
Okay. I mean, there's there's a lot of things. I guess probably two things come to mind as like the most useful things. The first one is being able to separate deploy from release. So when something goes wrong, it's much easier to pinpoint, did that happen when the release went out, or did that happen when I turned on this feature flag, which are two separate points in time. And it both decreases the chance that something catastrophic is going to happen, but it also makes it much easier to pinpoint what probably did go wrong when something does. And it's easier to just roll back the release or turn off the feature flag, depending on which one corresponds with the time. And then, yeah.
No, go. That's great.
I was going to say the other big one I've seen, which is really helpful, is being able to work with a team with, a bunch of different developers on a big feature and being able to like keep pushing that code to production, but just in an off state so that nobody, or maybe only a couple test accounts, can even see that feature at all. And so we can start to test things or just understand that it works with the rest of our code without having to expose it to anyone. And while it's still in a super rough state, it really makes working together much easier.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's some sort of inside detail about, we've done through some transitions where we want to try things and to be able to just toggle and see the stuff in your environment, not somebody else's. There's a customer who actually, some of you on this webinar may be in an environment where you're not really allowed to ship very often. And many people who have sort of enterprise customers are in a world where, they don't want changes every 30 minutes or every 5 minutes, right? But as a developer, the idea that you're only going to get to ship 4 times a year or twice a year is kind of maddening from a feedback loop or from a testing perspective, right? And so one of the patterns that I think is fascinating is teams that still have 2-week sprints or 3-week sprints and still ship to prod, but it's behind a flag. And meanwhile, the internal stakeholders are actually experiencing this fall release or this semi-annual release as it comes into shape, as the individual features come together. And then when it's all been chipped away at a little bit at a time and prove that it works, you can then flip one flag and the users are getting it, right? And then there's some cases where that same model applies and you've got some customers that want to take a faster stream of changes and some that want to take a slower stream of changes. And David showed segments earlier, but the idea that you could say, oh, okay, these people like it really slow, these people like it a little faster, and you could then release, I'm going to release this to half of my I like it faster people and see what happens. So the amount of control and the kind of ways that you can just get away from big bang, get away from high stress, high stakes, late night stuff, I think is the pattern that any way you can look into that. And the devil's in the details. And what I think is fascinating, I get some sort of behind the scenes stuff when we're talking to new customers. We love to collaborate with you about getting from where you are to where you want to go. You don't have to suddenly be sure that you could do 100 releases a day to want to use something like what we do. We work with people who are moving along that continuum, and not every problem is easy, but it's amazing how problems can be peeled apart and solved. Let me check the questions again to see what else we've got here.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to think there. Like on the common patterns, I think like the most common pattern I see is like once we start breaking things, then we tend to want to build a lot more thorough validation, which is not a bad thing in a sense, but then we tend to slow everything down. And and this is where like what Joy was saying about decoupling release and deployment is like, because we tend to mix those two things together, then we tend to slow down deployment. And then we tend to really pile up changes on each deployment. And so the challenge now is we tie all the teams together a lot more. And if anybody has anything wrong, then we have to bring everybody back. And we have to figure out among the whole mass of things that have changed, then what is a culprit, or what are the culprits, because there can be more than one. And so sometimes, a train can hide another one. And so you have to basically like really navigate that. And it tends, like, it can be counterintuitive, but actually your deployment are much less risky if you do them a lot more often because you have a lot less thing in them. If you think of every change has a risk associated with it, the less change you have, the less risk you have. And then it really helps also teams not being locked on each other. And that's where, like, when you add feature flag, you decrease the inherent risk of any change very significantly. So you can basically get your deploys to be much more frequent, and then you can basically do your validation after, like, not fully after. You still need to do, I would still highly recommend to do some validation before that, but you don't have to do it as sequentially. You can do more continuous validation rather than just a semi-waterfall validation because of your deployment process.
Awesome. Okay, so those of you who arrived in the, after we had just started, we did play a video that one of my colleagues made. Is pretty hilarious. We're going to run that at the very, very end of the webinar, which is coming up shortly. But before we get to that, I want to hand it back to Scott and let him take us to the next slide.
All right. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I just want to thank all of you guys. Those videos were really fun, and we are going to see that first one again here to close us out. But great demos, and I do have to ask, Joy, tell us about your costume. What are you?
I'm a kitsune. It's a mythical Japanese fox.
Oh, that's awesome. And David, you got to show off those skeleton arms.
I'm actually Superman this year.
Yeah. My costume's off camera. I'm supposed to be Captain America, but oh, there we go. The PA. That.
Oh,
nice.
Pierre's in with his mask.
I kept the scary slightly out of this call.
All right. Well, thanks to all of you for just a really fun presentation and just fascinating stuff about feature flags and testing applications and how to roll them out. So I'm going to let you guys go and go ahead to the prize drawing. So thanks again. All right. And before we wrap up, we do have that Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $250 Amazon gift card is Rob Sedler from Pennsylvania. So congratulations to Rob. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Split by Harness for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. So we're going to end the event now, but as that little bonus, we'll replay Harness's spooky video for those of you who came in late. Enjoy and happy Halloween, everybody.